Hello, everybody. Welcome to tonight's webinar. If you're a new offender to this, my name is Justin, and I'm a functional genomics practitioner with the DNA company. So Justin's the name, and functional genomics is the game. And I'll tell you, tonight we're covering a really important topic, and it comes up all the time as a practitioner. It's one of these things that's just a recurring theme, and we're talking about inflammation. So as a practitioner, I find myself playing a game of like identifying the arsonist, right? Because everybody's got some sort of inflammatory condition. There's a lot of really, variable symptoms that you can land with. It could be skin, it could be brain fog, achy joints. So it can be a really tough thing to actually identify the sources of. And I'll tell you that functional genomics, some of these diagnostic tools that we use are really useful because you can actually see a lot of the underlying imbalances with someone's genetic blueprint. And the trickle down effect of that can be any number of inflammatory symptoms. There's really two main types of inflammation that we talk about. And it's an important distinction here because there's that acute response, right? Which is like the body gets injured or gets sick, and there's an acute inflammatory response. That's perfectly natural, and that's something that we want. But modern day, we've introduced so many different things that are screwing with our bodies that it's kind of transformed from an acute response to more of a systemic response. And that's where a lot of these problems are coming from. It's a chronic response now. So understanding your genes and understanding what lifestyle behaviors and tactics you can intervene with to help counteract and reduce the inflammation is a really useful thing to do. So that's what we're here to do. We're going to educate you a little bit tonight on what we see in the genes and what we're running into clinically, and some of the behaviors, lifestyle strategies, supplements, etc., that you can put in place in order to deal with a lot of this inflammation that seems to be so chronic. Joining me tonight, I'm so excited because this is the first one that we've ever done together, is the phenomenal Dr. Tracy Steady Hardcastle. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Thank you, Justin. I'm very excited. You're a legend in this space, and so I'm really excited to be here with you. My name is Tracy Steady Hardcastle, and I am a doctor of acupuncture and Chinese medicine and a certified functional genomics practitioner also. And I saw a lot of inflammation in my practice. I mean, that's one of the things that I saw in almost every condition that came to me was a thread of inflammation was in there somewhere. And acupuncture deals with that pretty well. So that's one of the reasons that people responded so well to it. But yeah, where would you like to start tonight, Justin?
Well, I would like to remind everybody to make sure that you do the poll and participate in that if you can, because that really helps us to guide the conversation a little bit and just see where everybody's at in the audience. We've got a pretty sizable audience tonight, so I'm curious where you guys are at. So please take a minute to go ahead and fill out that poll. While you're doing that, let's just talk a little bit about what inflammation really is and why it's become such a problem. So, like I mentioned, this is an acute response, right? So there's something called the innate immune system. That's like the immediate response when you get COVID or when you tweak your ankle or something like that. The body has all these incredible built-in mechanisms to handle that and to deal with that. So that's called the innate immune system, right? It fires it up, it targets the GI pathogen or whatever it is and clears debris out of the cells. When that becomes insufficient and there's not enough of that to use, your body starts to kick in the adaptive immune system, right? So it's like this acquired immune system that your body uses in order to target the secondary offenses there. As I see it, and let me know if you have a different opinion, Dr. Tracy, I think that now we have so many different inputs that are causing the triggering of inflammation, even as just a slow trickle, that the immune system in and of itself is a little bit overburdened. Like we've got the toxic burden to consider. We've got things like Wi-Fi. We've got things like mold and pollution in the environment. And I think it's a bombardment of our natural systems that maybe our ancestors were perfectly equipped for, but we've added so many new elements, and it's like the genomic pathway gets kind of kicked off by some of these environmental stressors as well. So if we've got a combination of suboptimal genes in an area, and then we've also got environmental factors kicking off the wrong genes or causing suboptimal gene expression, we end up with this huge inflammatory response in the body. And it's like, it's so hard if you didn't have any actual like diagnostic data to work with. like how else would you actually identify what's the root cause? And you can add an omega-3 if you want, and you can do some cold showers, and those are great management tools. But using some of the tools that we use is definitely a great step in the right direction. How did your practice change when you started to add functional genomics? Like, did you find it served as identifiers for where people's inflammation was coming from?
Definitely. And it also helped me to know how to treat them better with herbs because I could tell what their bodies were going to respond to from a different lens other than just the original kind of diagnosis. And one of the ways that I would explain, this kind of chronic inflammation to my patients was, if you brought up an arsonist, right? So if you've got so one arsonist, the body comes in and it sends in all the rescue fire people and they put out the fire and they're like, okay, now we're going to go back to the firehouse and we're going to stay where we belong. But what if it's a team of arsonists and they're setting off little fires all over the place, right? Then you've got all of these emergency vehicles going all over the body and congesting everything, right? They're trying to do a job, but they can't quite get everything clear and go back to the firehouse, right? So then you still have the little fires and then you have the congestion of the emergency vehicles blocking your path. So um, trying to reduce that load with acupuncture, supplements, herbs, and all of that was definitely something that I did. And layering in the genes and knowing why, why are what is making the emergency team inefficient or what is overburdening, where are these arsonists coming from and why are they allowed to stick around? Why are they not getting cleared out by the emergency vehicles? So that's my analogy for you.
Yeah, and it's totally useful because if you think about it, what are your options at that point? Well, you have to either do one of two things or you have to do two of two things. Basically, you can add more resource as far as more emergency vehicles, right? Any city that does that is probably going to have a better response to it. So adding to the actual like capacity of the immune system, for example, that's really a useful thing. But then also being an identifier of like, why is this area inflamed in the first place? And the DNA 360 that we use, as well as the gut 360, which we'll get into a little bit tonight, really has a lot of indication there because, for example, oxidative stress, right? That can be one of those things that we consider a fire, something that's just internally causing fire in your body. Well, we have a whole pathway called SOD2 that we look at that can really be a great identifier of slow free radical clearance in the mitochondria. And that gumming up of free radicals in the mitochondria causes inflammation. And then there's lab work that you can do to really check that out as well. Like I'm a big fan of a marker called 8-OHDG for really looking at, free radical damage. It's actually measuring the damage of free radicals to the DNA, but it's a direct measurement. Like if you have elevated 8-OHDG, then you have a lot of oxidative stress going on. So there's all these different kind of connective points that you can look at your genes and understand the SOD2 pathway is suboptimal. And then you can also check it with lab work and look at the actual oxidative stress markers. So it just allows us to really see what are some of these sources of inflammation in the body. I think that hormone metabolites are another kind of hidden stressor that people talk about because you don't necessarily know it until you really look at the genes and understand that a lot of people have, like, for example, really inflammatory, toxic estrogen metabolites that are being created from puberty all the way up until menopause or andropause. That's a pretty significant just trickle of inflammation that the body has to deal with. And I've always looked at it like it's kind of the totality of the load, like the entire toxin load that the body has to deal with really tells you how much of an inflammation load your body has to deal with, and therefore how many fires do you have to put out. I know that we're itching to get into some more of these categories in the DNA 360, but if the powers that be wouldn't mind pulling up the poll, we can check out what people are saying. Lovely. Okay. So we asked a handful of questions here. The first one is, have you ever heard of silent inflammation before? Most of you said yes, 66%, 26% said no, and 8% said not sure. And I'll say, it's one of those questions, isn't it, where it's like, there's inflammation, but there's silent inflammation, which is much harder to identify. And that's what's stemming from a cellular level in some of these imbalances. So it's a bit of a tough one to identify. Number two, which of these symptoms have you experienced in the last 6 months? So quite a bit of people dealing with chronic fatigue. Definitely dealt with that before. Brain fog, 58% of you, 52% said digestive issues, the second brain. So that can also be correlative with the brain fog. Joint pain, stiffness, 68% of you, and skin conditions, 41%. Only 6% of you said none of the above. And congratulations to that 6% because that's phenomenal. Question number 3 is, have you ever had your inflammation levels tested on like a CRP, ESR, omega-3 index, etc.? Most of you said yes. So 58% said that you have, 33% said no, and then 9% of you said you're not sure. Totally fair. And there's lots of different ways that we look at this. And it's also a matter of understanding, like, we don't treat test results. We don't treat the paper, right? Like, people come to us in a particular health condition, and we always correlate the genes and the labs with what their actual experience is and how they're living. Like, do you feel like crap? Do you have brain fog? All of these things matter. If you're at 100% and you have suboptimal genes, I don't have that much work to do when you come to me, right? So we use these as tools to help address the issues. Number 4 is, do you have a known chronic condition like diabetes, autoimmune disorder, cardiovascular disease, etc.? And 45% of you said yes, that you do. 53% said no, and 1% said prefer not to say. Perfectly fair. So the last one, this is an open-ended question, so feel free to put it in the chat. What are you most hoping to learn from this webinar? 100% answered. So I'm curious to see what everybody had to say about that. Inflammation is just one of these ongoing things that I believe is a contributor to pretty much all chronic health conditions, right? Like, if it's autoimmune, or if it's eczema, or if it's just chronic pain, fatigue, I really think that there's a constant inflammation element in there. Do you agree with that?
Yes. And there are so many different ways that can arise. And there are different ways that the inflammation responds depending on where it comes from. And so, like you were saying before, you can go ahead and take an omega-3, which is great because part of the response system that shuts down the inflammatory pathways is omega-3s. So if you don't have enough omega-3s, you kind of can't shut that down, right? It's like if once again, just not having the right personnel for the job. So you need those as a basis, but you can take all the omega-3s you want. And if you still have something coming into your body over and over again that you can't detox, or you can't clear a pathogen out of your system or something like that, you need to get those things in place in order to actually resolve it.
Yeah, and I think also, like, the omega-3 to 6 ratio is a really important thing to consider there, which a lot of people, I find that health coaching sometimes is a process of deletion before it's a process of addition. And it's like, if you keep your same pro-inflammatory diet and add an omega-3 source in, you haven't done any harm, but you've not necessarily corrected the imbalance. And I'll tell you, it's actually really hard to get the omega-3 and omega-6 ratio where you want it. Like, I've seen people that are on, like, what you would consider a good quality, like, paleo diet, who still have, like, a lot of omega-6 dominance going on there. But it adds up, right? It adds up so quick with, like, even just the almonds and the olive oil, and most plants have some sort of oil in there, and a lot of it does convert to omega-6s. So it's pretty difficult to get that ratio down. When it comes to omega-3s, I'll say I've also been experimenting with this fatty 15 stuff. Have you ever messed around with that?
I have looked at it. I just haven't. I've not taken the plunge into trying it myself. It's on the list though, so I'm very curious to hear how you like it.
Yeah, I actually like it. I've noticed a little bit of, I guess you would call it, clarity. I'm pretty sensitive to what supplements and things that I use, but if you guys aren't familiar, there was actually a new fatty acid discovered, the first one in like 70 years to be discovered, and it's called C15. And it's actually an extract of, like, full fat dairy products, but you can take it in, of course, a more concentrated format. And it's touted to be basically a lot of the same benefits of omega-3 with regard to inflammation, but it's about 3 times stronger, right? So it's doing a lot of those jobs at a rate of like 3 times better than omega-3s would do. So I've added it in. I've noticed a bit of a benefit, and I think that it's a pretty cool thing to be messing around with. What are some of your kind of go-tos when it comes to not only the management of inflammation, but then the more specific stuff that you would add in once you've identified, red flags in someone's genes?
Well, if it's an illness that they haven't been able to clear, we have to look at their immune system. And that's where we're looking at vitamin D and zinc and, all of those kinds of um, cornerstones of immunity, and just what else is going on in their bodies, and getting that immune system to feel a little bit better. So that would be, why aren't there enough rescue personnel, right? So how do we recruit more personnel to put out these fires, right? Whereas if it's from the environmental toxin load, then how do we minimize that and boost the pathways that can help clear out those toxins? And you mentioned the SOD2 gene, and if the GPX isn't matching, then you might end up with too much peroxide. So there are all of these little things that can happen inside the body that can cause something. So the more information we have, the better we can help to identify it. So, our testing is at the DNA company is wonderful. And then some of the blood tests to see what's going on in a moment to moment way, because that's something that we can measure and then test again and see how it's resolving. So of course we're calibrating on how the person feels first and foremost. But we do also have these other tools at our disposal right now to be able to manage these things a little bit differently. Mood and stress relief is also another place that I think of. And stress can definitely affect the gut, and it can cause inflammation on its own, because if you think about, the stress response, it's trying to get us to do something, right? Fight or flee or something like that. And all of those chemicals, when they're not cleared out, I think they're kind of inflammatory. So also managing that side of things, really looking at the whole person for the strategy. And sometimes people need to implement more than one. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, and I think that stress is really like one of the biggest categories because it's kind of an umbrella term for so many different things. Like when I talk about stress with clients, I'm talking about GI pathogens. I'm talking about HPA axis dysfunction. I'm talking about the elevated hormone metabolites and things that we've already mentioned. I'm looking at food sensitivities. I'm looking at poor methylation, poor glutathionization. These are all subcategories that could really be put under the primary category of stress on the body. Like all of these things are taking the body and kicking it out of homeostasis because it's like an irritant that the body doesn't really have an option but to react to. On the last webinar I did, I talked quite a bit about food sensitivities, and that's like a major thing that actually keeps the immune cells just circulating and on guard, ready to attack something everywhere. And I really think that when we have a lot of these food sensitivities and gut dysbiosis going on, it's almost inevitable that you're going to have inflammatory symptoms as well. How much work do you do on people's guts? Do you find that that's becoming like more and more thematic as you move forward with your practice?
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. The the things that we're eating now are not necessarily what our bodies were designed for, quite frankly. And and antibiotic use, which I've had to take a lot of antibiotics in my life, and then the rebuilding that has to happen from there, and putting all the right things into the gut in order to um, have the right microbiome it can be quite a lot of work. And that's where having answers to what is going on, because taking the wrong probiotic can be detrimental. And so knowing what's going on in your gut is really big. And, the gut stuff is tied to all kinds of autoimmune stuff and anxiety and joint pain. Like all of it can originate right there. And in Chinese medicine, actually, there's a whole like school of thought around everything originating in digestion, the the earth element. So that's definitely something that has always kind of been on my radar. And now science is proving that theory is pretty spot on, in my opinion.
Yeah, I think that it's definitely one of the main movers there. And this is where there's a lot of value in some of the tests that we offer. Like there's really two main ones that I really think people should consider. The DNA 360, obviously, it's going to give you the most bang for buck as far as like different areas of the body. We look at it in terms of these different systems of genes, right? So for those of you who don't really know what we're talking about, I mean, the human genome is massive, right? There is a lot of genes doing a lot of things. The DNA company sort of whittled it down to the most actionable and understood genes that are associated with the main systems of the body, right? So here's how your hormones work, here's how your detox works, your methylation, here's how your insulin mechanism works, the vitamin D mechanism, here's how mood and behavior works, right? So we've separated into some of these categories that really are going to have the most overall impact on how your body functions. So we're not using it to diagnose, we're not using it to try and really isolate a disease. What we are saying is that this is the baseline blueprint of how your body's enzymes were encoded, the different speeds of the enzymes. We can actually see that by testing your genes. So that has a major trickle down effect to how this system operates, or maybe doesn't operate particularly well. So what we do is that we clinically correlate, right? So we look at the genes, we look at the person, we look at how they live themselves into this scenario, and then we correlate and we say, this is how we're going to now live you out of it. So the DNA 360 has so many indicators of underlying inflammation in there that it's unreal. You can look at genes associated with lactose tolerance or gluten tolerance. You can look at gut detox, which has huge implication when it comes to things like autoimmunity that Dr. Tracy just mentioned. So that's one side of things. The gut is the other side of things, right? So I'm a big fan of doing these GI maps. Some sort of gut mapping is really useful because this is not a genetically encoded thing, right? When we're talking about what bugs are there and what bugs aren't there, understand that bugs, this isn't even your body at this point. This is a foreign thing that's got huge impacts on how your body functions, but it's not you. It's something different than you that happens to have a symbiotic relationship. So we have something called the Gut 360, and it's a new and improved version. It's the best that you can get on the market. And it's going to be showing you a lot of different indicators of dysbiosis, proteobacteria versus the other two phylum that are supposed to be more dominant. And then there's a lot of correlatives there to what can happen because of the dominance that you have, right? So skin conditions, any number of different chronic conditions, you have a lot of indicators in your gut. So when we combine these two, you've got the GI mapping, and then you've got the actual DNA 360, full 360-degree view of functional genomics. We've got a lot of indicators now as to who that arsonist is, right? And then someone like Dr. Tracy is going to be able to step in there and see what to do about it. I would say that when you look at the gut, would you mind explaining a little bit the connection point to gut and autoimmunity and inflammation and why that's so important in this discussion?
Yeah, absolutely. And even some of the genetic things about it, right? And so when we think of certain genes that have to do with endothelial tissue, we think of, things like the blood vessels and the brain and uterus, but also there's one layer that is the go-between between the gut and the bloodstream. And if that gene isn't doing its job efficiently, if it's suboptimal, then things can kind of get through that shouldn't. Certain things might not be absorbed well. Things can just get a little funny, and then you can have inflammation because you might have the immune system overreacting to something or underreacting, and you might end up with a buildup of bacteria and things that you don't want in the gut. And that is because we have more cells that are not us than cells that are us. Who they are is a really big deal. It's sort of like you don't just want to let anyone into your house, right? Just to feel popular, right? You want to be selective about who's in your life, who's in your house, who's hanging out with your kids. You know what I mean? It's not just pulling in strangers off the street. And that's how it is. Your gut microbiome, that's pretty intimate. It's inside your body. And so really knowing who's in there and how they're affecting things, because some of the what do you call them? Some of the bacteria that's in your gut really balances out mood, helps produce serotonin, things like that. People who don't secrete a lot of serotonin on their own, they really need to pay attention and make sure that their gut is optimal, because you want as much as you can get from your gut to kind of help compensate for what you're not secreting naturally because of your genetics. So if there's any kind of imbalance in the gut, it can show up as inflammation. And then that can lead to inflammation elsewhere in the body.
Yeah, absolutely. All of these microbiota have different kind of functions in the body, and a lot of them are there to create these short chain fatty acids, which are like these anti-inflammatory lipids that exist in the gut. So if you have a dysbiosis there, a lot of the times the ones that are supposed to be producing that anti-inflammatory short chain fatty acid, they get kind of silenced or muted by some of the more, pathogenic bacteria that exist in there. So to me, that's where I'm a little bit hesitant when it comes to some of these diet recommendations. Like, personally, I am a big fan of doing some of these elimination diets as far as identifying food sensitivities and things in people. But I think that when it comes to longer term restriction of certain food categories, we want to be a little bit careful there because it really can disrupt the alpha diversity in the gut. So I view it as more of an experiment than I do of like a long-term strategy for most people, unless you're super duper reactive to it, like some of the other people are. What are your thoughts on that? Like, do you like to do, elimination diets, or like, what do you do for people who are really reactive to food groups?
100%. I'll do those, but it's always temporary. And even like things like keto and FODMAP, low FODMAP diets, all of those things are like I think of them as like an intervention, like putting a cast on your leg. You don't keep the cast on forever, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to walk normally, right? I'm assuming the cast is on your leg. So, um, so once again, it's there for a purpose. It's there for a test, and then you move on once you figure out the rest of your life, what that's going to look like. And um, just like and the other thing that I was thinking about was too much and too little um are both not great. So we're kind of looking for the baby bear spot with things, whether it's exercise. To exercise helps reduce inflammation in the short term acutely. It's a little bit of an arsonist, but in a good way. It's like it's burning something that, like a brush pile. You've raked all the sticks and everything up in your yard, and it kind of sets fire to that, and then your yard is clean. But too much of it with the wrong genetics, or suboptimal for certain genes, I should say, and you could have more inflammation. And so being really aware of what our bodies specifically like is, I think, really important. So because the dose of a lot of things is really important. And exercise was just the first one that popped into my mind, but that's really true of a lot of things. And so instead of cutting out entire sections of food, doing moderation in things once the healing has begun can lead to a lot more diversity in the gut microbiome.
Yeah, it's like when you introduce some of these hormetic stressors, but like too much of them can push you and tip the scales toward chronic inflammation. And exercise is a great example. If you were to do like a really hard leg day and then take a bunch of blood markers, like, yeah, your cortisol is probably up and your CRP is probably up, and but it is part of that acute response, right? That innate immune system has been kind of triggered because of the activity that you had there. What are some of the other genes that you look at? Like, I know that we have such a map that we like to talk about. I mean, there's genes in the cardiovascular system, reports that are really important there, and the hormone reports. If you had to pick like a top few that you go to, what are you looking at?
I do like the NP21, which I talked about in terms of the lining of the um, blood vessels. Definitely, I mean, I do a lot of hormone stuff. So I would be looking definitely at the hormonal pathway. And it's interesting, you said something earlier about hormones, and there's this thing, like this sort of saying that perimenopause and menopause are inherently inflammatory. And I hear that and I believe it and I see it everywhere. But my question is always why, right? Why is it? Is it just the buildup of people's um, of the not being able to clear them properly and then becoming more of an inflammatory, toxic picture throughout their whole lives? Or is it something about things going up and down? And so that's just a question that I have. And so those genes are something that I'm looking at constantly, which are the CYP genes, CYP1A1, 1B1, and 3A4, are all genes that I look at really regularly to see how people are processing estrogen specifically.
Yeah, and it's a good point because so if you look in your hormone like profile that we talk about, it's important to know that we categorize things as being either dominant or balanced, right? So we try not to talk about genes as far as like good or bad, because there can be ups and downs to either one of these profiles. But as an example, if I see someone has a dominant profile, right? So we look at a gene called CYP17A1, and that's really one of the first steps in the steroidogenesis pathway. We're just talking about sex hormones. And basically, progesterone gets converted into testosterone by this gene, CYP17A1. And by knowing the genotype, we can see sort of the speed of that enzyme. And that really determines how much initial testosterone gets converted off of your progesterone, which then has all kinds of different, pathways that it follows. It can androgenize, it can aromatize, and then there's metabolites thereafter that it can convert into. But I'll tell you, it's definitely thematic for me when I see someone has dominance, right? So they're creating a lot of testosterone off that initial progesterone. There's good in it in that you may have an easier time building muscle. You may, athletic performance may be, easier for you. Sex drive might be higher. I mean, there's certainly some pluses, but we do see a lot more, hormone related inflammatory red flags in those kinds of people as well. And remember that this is cumulative, right? So from the second you hit puberty, if you've got that fast CYP17A1 gene all the way up until you are in andro or menopause, you're creating additional sex hormones, which are very strong. They don't whisper their signal at the body, they shout it. So a whole lifetime of that, not knowing it, that is a slow and steady source of inflammation for you, that's a really useful thing to know, because then we can counteract it. We can do different things with taking care of xenoestrogens in the environment, and maybe it's taking some aromatase inhibitors or something to help counteract some of the toxic metabolites there. We also look at something called glucuronidation, which is basically there's a family of genes called UGT. We look at UGT2B15 and another one called 2B17. The 7 is kind of the more dominant one there, but we look at it as a copy number variation. So how many did you get? Did you get 0, 1, or 2 copies from your parents? And this pathway is all about the clearance of some of these hormones, particularly androgens, right? Which can be pretty toxic. Like DHT has got some benefits, but it's also pretty toxic to the body. So even just the hormone profile is a map, but within that map, there's a lot of indicators as to actual inflammation and that slow trickle that's endogenous, right? So we take that and we add in all these external sources of inflammation, but just some people naturally are creating more toxins because of their sex hormones. Do you see a strong correlation with dominant profiles, especially, and like inflammatory symptomology?
Absolutely. And it can be from in a couple of different pathways. And so, I was talking about the CYP17A1. If that can be a reason why suddenly in menopause where there's a steep drop. So men kind of like slowly have their hormones decrease unless they're doing things to make that not happen, which is possible.
Yeah.
But with women, once again, unless they're intervening in some way, suddenly their balance of estrogen and progesterone to testosterone, if they're a fast aromatizer, is really out of whack, and that can be a really inflammatory time for them. But estrogen dominance can also be really inflammatory, and so when progesterone starts to drop off, and it typically is the first thing, not always, but a lot of times it's the first one to drop off, you end up with this imbalance between estrogen and progesterone, and that can cause a lot of symptoms like weight gain and um, just feeling achy and um, just kind of inflamed. So,
Yeah. I'll share an area I go to that a lot of people don't necessarily connect the dots with, like the vitamin D profile. I mean, 60+% of the population is deficient in vitamin D. And what a lot of people don't know is that that's a totally genetically encoded pathway, which makes a lot of sense, because like there is such thing as vitamin D toxicity. And a lot of our ancestors that would have lived in more southern climates would have dealt with that. And millennia of that can certainly have changed people's enzyme expressions to where your body doesn't actually rapidly activate vitamin D as a protective genetic mechanism there. Vitamin D is very anti-inflammatory. It's like one of the main things. And there's kind of a funny nuance, isn't there, where people talk about sun exposure as being dangerous. And I recognize completely You don't want to get sunburned. I've never advocated that. And obviously, we don't want to get skin cancer. However, vitamin D and the anti-cancer benefits, to me, it's one of those things where we don't want to talk about it as being poisonous to our body. We need vitamin D. It's tremendously anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer. Most of us, have at least one of those genes out of the three that we look at as suboptimal. So we need to really pay attention to that, because vitamin D and lacking it can be hugely pro-inflammatory, right? So I love like AM sun tanning. Like one of my primary, I live in Canada, so it's not always available, but when it is, one of my best lifestyle strategies that I implement with myself as well as any of my clients is AM grounding and sun tanning. I'm telling you, if you can just take your socks and shoes off and get like a 20-minute burst of sunshine first thing in the morning, that's huge. I mean, you've dropped off positive ions, you're increasing nitric oxide, your body's going to start manufacturing vitamin D for the whole rest of the day. I love that, and it's natural and it's totally free to do. What do you like as far as just not even supplements, but lifestyle tactics and behaviors that are anti-inflammatory? What are some of your go-tos?
Sleep. I know that sounds perhaps silly, but we do a lot of healing in our sleep. Our brain clears a lot of things when we sleep, so we don't end up with a bunch of stuff clogging our brains up. And growth hormone, which declines as we age anyway, but a lot of healing takes place. You know how when you're sick, if you sleep a lot, you tend to get better more quickly, and that's because a lot of healing happens in sleep. But sleep hygiene, I'm sure that I'm sound like a broken record at this point, but making sure that your environment is conducive to sleeping, making sure that you're not doing things right before bed that can keep you awake, monitoring how late you have caffeine, things like that. And then the morning light also helps regulate the circadian rhythm. So not getting any morning light can actually confuse your body about what time it is, when you're supposed to be awake, when you're supposed to be asleep, as well as meal timing for some people can be a big factor. For some people, it's not a big deal at all. For me, if I eat too late, my sleep is terrible. And it's not that I have trouble falling asleep. I have trouble staying asleep. I wake up in the middle of the night and I'm like, oh, I'm awake now. And it's because I ate late and my body was like, all right, it's time to go. What are we doing? Are we going to work out? Are we going to go to work? What are we going to do? So
Right.
I think that sleep is a huge, huge thing. And also the morning light, it actually helps to activate something that keeps appetite in check. So also depending on some of the genetic things that are in the DNA 360, we're always looking for things that can help people whose genes are suboptimal in some way. And so that's a really simple way to get a lot of bang for your buck.
Yeah, and I love the horizon gazing tactic when it comes to the regulation of circadian rhythm. Like especially if you're like me and you have a suboptimal clock gene, it's literally called clock. It makes it so much harder for your body to like adapt to a schedule. And so one of the main just low hanging fruit things that I get people to do is in the AM as well as in the evening is just go gaze at the horizon. Like don't look at the sun, obviously, but even if it's covered by clouds, your eyes actually are able to pick up on the different kind of light wavelengths that exist, as well as the angle of the sun itself, right? So it's called a low solar angle when it's like closer to the mountains, or I guess if you live somewhere flat, just wherever that horizon point is, your eyes can pick up on where it is. So if you go out there first thing in the morning and look in the direction of the sun, first thing, your eyes will recognize the kind of yellow, blue, red spectrum, and then also recognize the angle of the sun. And it goes, oh, okay, it must be morning time. Then you do it again in the evening, and it's more of a red, spectrum at that point, and it's also a low solar angle. So your brain goes, oh, it must be evening time, right? And it'll pull your melatonin, serotonin, cortisol rhythm into what it's supposed to be, which is very much diurnal, right? We are not nocturnal, we're diurnal. So I love that as a strategy. Um, what about more advanced stuff? Like, do you dabble in, are you hacky? Like, do you do a lot of biohacks too when it comes to quelling inflammation?
Uh, I really like light therapy. So I do like that. I have a sauna, an infrared sauna, and I use red and blue light therapy in my practice and in my home. It depends what you mean by biohacky. So like I prefer heat over cold. Like I don't do cold plunges because that's just not right for my body. at this time, but some people do. So what are you thinking? What are you wondering about, Justin?
Well, biohacking is such a broad term, right? I
Yeah,
mean, really, almost everything we've
exactly.
talked about is biohacking. But I do think that the introduction of some of these hormetic stressors like heat as well as cold can be useful. I think cold is something that you have to be a little bit careful with. And I'm really a fan of like minimum effective dose when it comes to that. But I will say that there is a logic to cold exposure when it comes to the quelling of chronic inflammation. And if you think about it, if you were to sprain your ankle, then people will ice it. I actually don't think you should do that for an acute injury, but it does work, right? It does help to get the inflammation out of the areas. So that's a real zoomed in injury. And if we actually look at chronic or systemic inflammation as being more total body, just slow trickle of inflammation, I do think that if we were to use as a habit and a lifestyle strategy, small amounts of total body immersion in cold, which remember is a hormetic stress, 2/3 of the earth are covered in cold water, and the human body has built in mechanisms to deal with that particular stress. We've rendered those mechanisms totally dormant, right? Because we created room temperature. No other species has something called room temperature. That's something we just sort of agreed upon. And meanwhile, that stress of cold is like it exists all over the earth and we've avoided and gotten away from it. I think that dabbling in it can have some pretty good anti-inflammatory effects. I think that it's a bit overrated when it comes to weight loss. People saying that if you add cold exposure, it's going to help you shed pounds. I'm not so sure I've seen the evidence of that, but I will say sometimes weight gain is just like tissue inflammation. Like people are just watery and inflamed in general. And I think that the more anti inflammatory strategies that we have, the better. So I'll tell you, I mean, some of the more go to things that I do is like I love the grounding. I saw people in the comments discussing that as well. And shout out to you guys because grounding is awesome. The sun exposure, I really like. Just a quick cold shower when I'm done with that as well. It's nothing crazy. I'm talking about 90 seconds in the cold. I preface it with some breath work to kind of counteract that mammalian dive reflex that makes you hyperventilate. And it really can make it a pretty cortisol heavy practice. So appropriate cold and doing it right as well, I think can be a pretty powerful strategy. But I got to share this one thing that I've been doing that I'm in love with as well, because it's been one of my favorite things lately. I've got this big PEMF mat that I've talked about before on this podcast. And lately I've been all about doing yoga on my PEMF mat. It's awesome because we all know yoga's got so many benefits as it is. If you just did yoga on a normal mat, you're already better than 90% of the population as far as like what you've done for your body that day. But I'm telling you, there's something about yoga on this mat that is like making my day like totally amplified. You're stretching, you're getting, your hip flexors and your spine, everything opened up. But meanwhile, I'm just blasting my body with PEMF. It's got infrared built right into it, as well as negative ions. So I love it because I can use it in the wintertime as well and effectively get the grounding effect also. Have you dabbled in that, like PEMF?
I haven't, but I'm very interested in doing so. I hear it's phenomenal and really, really cool. So
Yeah. Oh, yeah. For pain management. And it really works on the Earth's magnetism. And we're not affiliated with the company that I like or anything here, but I'm just going to mention them because it's an awesome product. It's called Higher Dose. And I like it because it's the same size as me. It's like 6 feet tall, 6 feet long. And it's really skookum. It's got like amethyst crystals and stuff inside of it. So it's like, some yoga mats, they kind of slide all over the place, or it's just like, you do downward dog and the thing, your feet stretch the mat all out. This is like a really thick, just well made mat. And I'm blasting my body with so many healing frequencies at the same time. So that's a really useful thing that I've been adding in as well. And another thing that I really like is something called carbon 60. It's a peptide that's highly anti inflammatory. I know we're not supposed to totally recommend peptides. We say do your research. Is that an area that you've dabbled in? Like, do you recommend peptides, or have you ever used them on yourself?
I have used and recommended peptides in certain circumstances. Yes, a bunch of them that even you've talked about them on a podcast before, and some of them are. I was like, oh yeah, I've used that one. So
Yeah. Tiffany in the comments is asking what peptide I just mentioned. It's called carbon 60 or C60. You can get it in orally available format, so you don't have to inject it. And once again, I'm just saying do your research. That's not an official recommendation of mine, but I have done my research on my body and I find that I like the effects. And if you actually look at it, it's a really interesting molecule that can actually help to kickstart endocrine function. It's got huge antioxidant capacity as well. Like, it's touted to be hundreds of times stronger than vitamin C. And it's pretty specific to the mitochondrial pathway as well. So way back in the call, when we talked about SOD2 and we talked about 8-OHDG and these inflammatory markers associated with oxidative stress, that's the pathway that carbon 60 is acting upon. And it's also anti-inflammatory in and of itself as well. So I've found it to be pretty useful on a few different, planes of how our physiology works. So really just lifestyle tactics, right? I mean, the more that you can do, it's funny, in my coaching, I'm finding myself more and more recommending just like air filters and water filters and like ways that you can like cleanse your produce. How much of that low hanging fruit do you get into? Like, it must start general before you get into the crazy hacks and everything, correct?
Right. Yeah. Very and simple things, and not all of them are inexpensive, but they once you get a water filter or an air filter or something like that, then you're kind of good to go. You're just replacing little pieces of it, right? And so it can feel like a lot all at once, but then once you've done it, you're just existing that way. And it's the same thing with things like exercise and meditation, where people think, oh, I would have to sit on a cushion for an hour in order to get benefit from it. And you don't have to sit. It doesn't have to be for very long. Like, there are ways of doing these things. You can take a walk outside and it can be a walking meditation, and you're paying attention to what you see and what you hear and what color that bird is. I live in the country, so it's easy for me, but you could do it in the city too. Like, oh, look at that building, look at that person's purse, and just being really present. And the stress relief techniques of exercise and meditation, I think, are really also helpful for inflammation, um, because quieting the mind and moving the body just enough. For some people can't, there's a lot of things about, doing a lot of resistance training, which I love resistance training. I absolutely love it. But when people are recovering from something, or if they have a lot of chronic inflammation, going too hard in the exercise space can make them feel a lot worse. And then they get discouraged about exercising. And it does have anti inflammatory properties. So that's why I just like take a 5-minute walk and really try to focus on being present with yourself when you're doing it. And I think it's a 2-for-1 situation, because you're calming your mind and moving your body.
Yeah, well, that's where a lot of the hormetic stressors can be taken too far. And like, a hormetic stressor really should trigger positive adaptations in the body, especially when it comes to the long term. In the short term, a stress is a stress, right? But I think that hormesis is a balancing act. It's very much a homeostatic mechanism in the body. And fasting is hormesis. Too much fasting is just stress, right? Exercise, hormesis, overtraining, stress, cold, heat. I mean, you can overdo it with anything. Um, you made a good point there, because, like, as much as I love to talk about biohacking and a lot of my coaching, I mean, I incorporate, everything from traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, all the way up to full on biohacker crazy, like just gadgetry and supplements and protocols. Oftentimes, if I have the option to just go for a walk in the sunshine, I'll choose that, right? Like, I like that simplicity of it. But sometimes you don't have the time, or it's a crappy day out, or there's a forest fire, and if I go for a walk, I'm actually flooding my body with more toxins than I wanted to. And if I sit next to my HEPA filter and do something here, I'm able to negate some of those issues. So it's like, just making that point, because like some people get a little bit eye rolly when it comes to biohacks, and it's like, understand, I favor the natural methods first, right? Normal food over supplements, exercise over Ozempic. Okay. But sometimes we need to combine some of these strategies. And especially when we have suboptimal genes, there's added layers of interventions that are necessary, because we're trying to compensate for a job that is not being done on its own, right? So that's where some of the advanced strategies come into play. And I always talk about this moving from general to specific thing. Because listen, if you're a patient of mine and you vape and you're up till 3 in the morning playing Call of Duty, I love video games as well. I don't play them, I love them, but I'm going to start really general, right? There's things that are obvious. I don't even need to look at your gene to know that you shouldn't be doing some of these lifestyle tactics. But once we've gotten rid of those, then we're able to move from general to specific and more peel back the layers. Understanding the genetic blueprint, understanding gut dysbiosis, it guides me. It's a guiding document to allow me to know these are areas that are red flags and problematic, and these are the areas that we need to reinforce, because the universe didn't do that for you, right? Like in our ancestors' day, this gene presentation might have been fine, but modern day, it's not. So there's always going to be areas that we need some more advanced protocols. And that's where the peptides and the red light therapies and the PEMFs of the world come into play. I know that we want to get into some Q&A here. Is there anything that you wanted to talk about? I mean, you're an acupuncturist. I'm sure you utilize that as an anti-inflammatory strategy. Any other go-tos or tactics that you want the people to kind of walk away with today?
I mean, when I'm practicing, in addition to being physically with people and doing acupuncture and things like that, I also would utilize herbs a lot. And inflammation is looked at a little bit differently in Chinese medicine, in that there's the heat presentation, which is like a lot of redness, and it could be like arthritis, or it could be a sprained ankle, anything that's like kind of angry and heat, like hot, But then there was also like dampness. And so that's when, have you ever gotten up and just been like, I look a little puffy. Are my allergens out? And or just my fingers are a little fatter than usual today. And that's just like that presentation of the fluid part of inflammation. And so dealing with that. And so figuring out what's causing those things, and then dealing with them with herbs was a big thing that I used to do in or that I still do in my practice. But also things like music, things I think, once again, I probably sound like a broken record, finding joy, music, art, laughing. Laughing is a cure for a lot of things. And from a Chinese medicine perspective, that joy picture is the cure for a lot of things. So I bring it up a lot.
Yeah, that PMA, right? The positive mental attitude needs to be behind every tactic that we talk about. And that is, again, one of those eye-rolly things. But let me tell you, there has been studies done on gene expression and positive mental attitude, and there is a direct correlation there. Your genes are replicating every 42 seconds of your life. And when you have chaos in your head, just understand your body doesn't know the difference between a perceived threat and a real threat, right? So if you're over here reliving some argument from the third grade, your body's taking that information and it's actually using it to program your genes in that moment. The expression of them, I'm saying, your genotypes are what they are, but your body can literally recreate and reinvent itself every minute. And if you wake up and you're one of these people that wakes up negative and you have a lot of just, bad internal dialogue, you're actually discouraging your body's expression. You're going to impact your immune system in a negative way. You're going to have less vital reserve, vital reserve and resource to deal with anything that comes your way, right? So PMA, just get those positive, powerful thoughts flowing, and your genes are going to literally express better. Like 4,000 different gene expressions were tested when it comes to PMA, and it actually did impact how they express themselves. So just know that that's not a hacky thing or a throwaway tactic. That is something that's underlying with everything we talk about. You're way better off with a positive mental attitude. We got a bunch of questions here, so I'm ready to dive into them if you are.
Yeah, let's do it.
Lovely. Okay, so we got some frequent offenders in the Q&A here, people that just love to come here and learn. So welcome to everybody. Susan has a good question. Do you have any experience with topical glutathione like Glutaril? If so, do you find it absorb better or about the same as liposomal glutathione, especially in those with digestive issues, including malabsorption? And if someone has a GSTM1 deletion, are there any issues with using glutathione, or does that person need more? I'll give my thoughts on this, and then I can toss it over to you if you have anything to add or a different perspective. So there's a lot of ways you can take in glutathione. And if you're not familiar, I mean, glutathione really initiates phase 2 detoxification. So it's very powerful antioxidant that the body makes. And we look at 3 different genes associated with glutathione. There's GSTT1, that's predominantly in the liver. There's GSTM1, which Susan mentioned here, that's predominantly the gut. And then there's GSTP1, which is predominantly the respiratory tract. And there's a lot of correlation here. Let's say you have suboptimal GSTP1, the respiratory tract, and you live in an area with a lot of smog. Well, now we have nature and nurture both working against you. And I think that it can kick off a lot of conditions and toxicity problems. With regard to intake of glutathione, the main one you actually want to look at is GSTT1, the first one I mentioned associated with the liver. That's considered to be kind of the big brother or sister of the glutathione gene family. And if you have deletions there, right? So if you have 0 or 1 copies of GSTT1, that's where we tend to be a little bit more careful with the utilization of glutathione as a supplement. Liposomal is a really good choice as far as absorbability if you can use it. I haven't seen a lot of real data as far as if that's better or worse than topical, but I will say that another cool way to do it is actually through what's it called, a nebulizer. You can actually nebulize glutathione and you can breathe it in as well, which gives you, it goes right through the alveoli into the respiratory tract. And it ends up in circulation pretty quick. So as far as like absorption rate, I think that that one is a really useful tactic as well. But just know GSTT1, if you're missing any of those copies, I don't really recommend supplementing with glutathione particularly often, just because it's the instruction manual for what to do with the glutathione. Right. So if we're missing an instruction and we take a big old dose, be that from topical sources, be that intravenous, be that nasally, be that, liposomal, you're missing the instruction. So your body's not going to know what to do with it. And it can rob your body of minerals. So be a little bit careful there. You may want to rely on the precursors a little bit more than glutathione itself, being your N-acetylcysteines and glycine and selenium and glutamine and these different things, as opposed to overloading the pathway with glutathione. You have any take on that? Do you have any experience with the topical versus other formats?
I do not, and you covered that whole question very thoroughly and well.
Okay. So
I
that's my answer, Susan. I hope that that's helpful. Looks like Marianne has one directed a bit at you. Do you have an answer for this one?
Yes, Marianne's asking if I've heard of PCSPES, herbal for prostate inflammation. So that I have not heard of it specifically for prostate inflammation. It is used in sometimes in adjunctively to cancer treatment. There are herbs that I would consider anti-inflammatory in it. So I would imagine in certain circumstances it could be used for prostate inflammation, but I always recommend working with a professional. I mean, I don't know who this is or what their health situation is or their genetics or anything. So I wouldn't say that I would recommend it, but it makes sense to me that it could be used in that way based on what is in it. Does that, hopefully that's a helpful answer.
Yeah, that was a good answer. That was as good a one as I would have had. Tiffany's got a question about omega-3s. So she's asking, aren't there certain genes that prevent you from using omega-3s properly? And is there a form that is easier to use than others? So in our panel, we don't test any genes really specified to that. However, we do have the ApoA2 gene that's really got to do with how your body processes fatty acids across the board. And I would say that that's of relevance there. Personally, when it comes to the form of the omega-3s, I mean, I have a few opinions on that. I think that it's one of those ones you don't want to just go to Amazon for or Costco for. I mean, there's a pretty high oxidation rate for a lot of just over-the-counter omega-3s. So I look for a couple of things, right? I mean, people know the basics, like a dark bottle, right? So the light doesn't penetrate it as easily. You can look at manufacturing dates and sourcing and different things. I mean, we got to remember what we've done to the oceans, unfortunately, as well. And that's going to have a trickle down effect into, salmon and some of these different wildlife that live in the ocean. I like gelatin capsules because our diet is typically gelatin deficient in the first place. So adding some gelatin in is useful. And some brands will actually go ahead and add in things like rosemary extract and some of these kind of anti-carcinogenic compounds. They'll add them right in with the omega-3s. So it prevents some of the oxidation. It can actually help that pathway a little bit. When it comes to soft gels as well, I mean, I like them to be just the actual capsule to be a little bit darker. Like you can get these red gelatin-based soft gels that really help to protect the lipids that are in there. And then it's a matter of the sourcing, right? Like getting them from the small fish, as opposed to salmon, usually like anchovy, mackerel, etc., are a little bit higher quality. Personally, I use a couple of different sources. I use the Fatty 15, like I mentioned, and I saw some love in the comments for that as well. So apparently some of our audience uses Fatty 15, which is great. And then I also use Keon as well. I like that they added in some of these anti-carcinogen effects into the capsules. And it's really good quality, just 2 a day kind of an omega fish oil. So I do both of those in the same day. And I think that that's a pretty good stack. And remember, it's really about this ratio of omega-3 to omega-6. So I really recommend doing a certain amount of work on your diet in tandem with the addition of an omega-3. I don't like omega-3, 6, 9 supplements typically because we're already so inundated with the omega-6s and potentially the omega-9s as well. And I don't think you're doing a lot of anti-inflammatory good by doing that. So I recommend just the 3. Do you have anything to add to that, Dr. Tracy?
Nope, I do not. That was
Lovely.
great.
um, Brenda's got a cool one, and I'm curious your thoughts on this. What do you think about algae products? Do you think that they're beneficial or that there's a place for them?
It depends on the algae supplement and the person, but yes, I have used them in the past with myself and with other people, depending on what they had going on. And I think that knowing which ones are helpful in which circumstances is really helpful. So I wouldn't necessarily recommend anything across the board for anyone, but I don't think that they're harmful, and I think that they can be helpful. What are your thoughts?
Definitely. I think that there is a lot of unique little micronutrients in there. And algae sources are normally an alternative for people that are like really plant-based, that won't do even like normal fish oils and things like that. Most vegetarians will. I mean, they'll still do. Most vegetarians that I know are more like pescatarians, and they'll add in like some fish and maybe some eggs or something like that. It's just the actual animals that they won't eat. But, there's definitely some omega-3s and things in algae sources. And I think that it's exactly what Dr. Tracy just said, like the cleanliness of them, the sourcing of them, that's really going to matter. But as more of a blanket answer, I do think there's a benefit to it.
And the dosage too. Like there's something that I like that has a lot of astaxanthin in it, and that it comes from a kelp, and it actually can help provide sunscreen too, as well as being a really good antioxidant. But once again, not everyone should take it. But that's the type of thing where if you don't take enough of it, it doesn't have necessarily the right benefits to it. But certain people shouldn't take too much of it because they have health conditions that make that a bad idea. And so that's just an example. I was like, I should give an example of what I'm talking about. And that's the one I came up with.
Yeah, well, and it's, all of these things are to be taken with, the concept of personalization, right? Like some people who, if you're on a blood thinner, for example, you're going to want to be pretty careful adding omega-3s in there because it's going to thin it out that much farther. So none of these are really meant to be like, recommendations that everybody should take. But I'll tell you, general to specific, that's why I bring that concept up so often, because it's like, I don't treat anybody without knowing something about them. You know what I mean? But if I hop on a webinar, it's safe to say, I can say for a lot of people, omega-3s are beneficial, grounding, all these things are beneficial. But this is why we do this, folks. We do functional genomics because we make it all about you and we zoom in on the person. Denise has a great question here. Would you please talk in detail about emotional stress and its effect on the gut microbiome and immunity? I love this question because it's an example of the thinking, right? The holistic way that we're looking at this. You said earlier in the call, we treat the person, right? And it's really, I love that. There's connections all over the place with these different systems. So My take on that is that, so there's something called the limbic system, right? Which is like our body, our brains identify different things that are coming in from the environment, and it triggers this cascade, this emotional cascade where the HPA axis is brought into play. And I'll tell you, whenever we have emotional stimulus, like I mentioned earlier, the body doesn't know the difference between a real threat and a perceived threat. Once your brain says, oh, threat, the body reacts in a certain way. It's a survival mechanism, right? So the body releases cortisol. Cortisol has anti-inflammatory properties. It also causes our liver to give us some glucose, so we have an immediate energy source to get away from whatever it is that's causing us stress, right? In our ancestors' day, it would have been a predator. Now it can be sitting in traffic and someone honks at you. It's the same mechanism, but it's just a modern way that it's being turned on all the time. So emotional stress will cause a cortisol release just like anything else would. And the thing is, we have this delicate balance in the body that's the cortisol to DHEA ratio, right? And that's a great indicator as to whether or not your body's in a anabolic state or a catabolic state, right? Cortisol is a catabolic hormone. DHEA is the parent to our anabolic hormones. So looking at that ratio is really important to understand HPA axis dysfunction and where our body is with regard to the nervous system. But when we have cortisol dominance over a period of time and we're no longer in that homeostatic place where we're balancing it with DHEA and we're recovering and we're sleeping well, etc., the cortisol will actually suppress an immunoglobulin called SIG-A, secretory IgA. IGs are immunoglobulins, right? So there's IgA, IgE, IgG. We talk about them in relation to different food sensitivities and things, but secretory IgA is like the main defender of the gut, right? So it defends your gut against, pathogens and some of these opportunistic species that might work their way into the gut. Too much cortisol will suppress SIG-A. Once SIG-A is no longer there, it's like you've taken the guard away from the door at the nightclub. Like anyone could just come in now, right? There's nobody standing there keeping them at bay. So cortisol suppresses SIG-A. SIG-A is no longer there, so that it's going to be letting anything through willy-nilly. The mucosal layer is just going to let GI pathogens through, and you're going to end up with dysbiosis. Dysbiosis can lead to leaky gut. Leaky gut can lead to autoimmune. And we have this big, long cascade thereafter. So I talk a lot about eating in a parasympathetic state, for example. That's a really good strategy for digestion. Helping your digestion is just like taking a moment with the food, taking a long out breath, being grateful for it, right? Gratitude is the highest frequency that we can achieve. And eating in a parasympathetic state and making sure that our body's in balance with regard to the nervous system has huge impacts on how well your gut performs. So to me, it's HPA axis stemming from the emotional stimuli, suppressing our immunoglobulins, and the immune system in the gut is impacted thereafter. Anything fun to add to that, Dr. Tracy?
I think just thinking about it in terms of fight or flight and rest and digest, like either we're doing one or we're doing the other. And so we're not, I mean, there of course is we can be in process between one and the other, right? It's not like it's, a door closes and you're in one or you're in the other, right? There's a flow. But some people, that's going to manifest as things pass through too quickly if they're too stressed out. More of a colitis picture. And for some people, it may present as more of a constipation picture where things are getting stuck and peristalsis is happening. Like the intestines aren't moving the way that they need to. And so that is going to affect the microbiome. If things are passing through too quickly, then you can't absorb what you need from them, and the microbiome is going to suffer for it. And if things are staying in there too long, then once again, it's not feeding the right things, and it can be feeding the bad things. So I wanted to break it down into like a really simple, like this, you're doing this, or you're doing that. It's sort of like being awake or being asleep.
Yeah, and by the way, I mean, these are all different things that you should be incorporating into your totality of your health plan, right? And that's why we brought up the Gut 360, because it's like you can actually look and see AI has got to a point where we can actually calculate these things where like there's no way for a person to look at a microscope and really give you, high quality information, because these things exist by billions and by the trillions, and there's so much going on there. AI is able to actually see what's going on, and the technology's there, folks. So I mean, you got to have a way to look at it. To me, these are all windows into the body. Every diagnostic lab that we run, everything that we do to have a viewpoint into how your body's actually functioning. I mean, that's all very valuable. So know what's going on in your gut. Look at your GI mapping. Look at your food sensitivities. Look at a mucosal barrier assessment. You know, we didn't even talk today about things like histamine, and I think that's a huge factor when it comes to this steady inflammatory response. So I recommend people look at histamine to DAO ratio, for example, right? Diamine oxidase breaks down histamine, and if one is elevated, the other should be elevated right alongside it, because that would be a natural and normal response. If you have elevated histamine and DAO is low, that's a good indicator of immune system dysfunction, because the natural homeostatic mechanism there is not being, it's not functioning. It's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So, doing really good quality labs, folks. I mean, it goes a long way to see how these are actually manifesting in the body. So Robin has a question. I'm actually not familiar with this one. I'm not sure if you are either. No?
No, I've not heard of that.
Okay, so the question is about something called the gut zoomer test. And I've actually never heard of it, but it sounds interesting. I can't imagine why they landed at the name zoomer. But I don't have a particularly intelligent answer for that one, so apologies. Kevin is asking about that C15 brand. So Fatty 15 is what it's actually called, and that's exactly what it is. It's C15. And it's pretty simple. I mean, you just take one capsule. It does have like a subscription option as well. So they just send you the refills. And like I mentioned, I actually have noticed a bit of a benefit from it. My current AM stack, I actually changed it a little bit. So forever I did like just a big tall glass of salt water with some lime in there and sea salt and hydrogen tablets. Lately, what I've been doing is, just as an experiment, is I've been doing a big tall glass with Cardio Miracle, Beam Minerals, and then the lime juice as well. But then I take my Fatty 15 and my Carbon 60 right there. So that's the very first thing that I take in the morning. And I'm going to see how that goes over the next couple of months and see if I'm going to switch back to a normal salt water or not. But really, my logic is, minerals are so important first thing in the morning. Hydration in general, totally important. And then I just think that having something that encourages blood flow and circulates a lot of anti-inflammatory ingredients throughout the day is really beneficial. So I've been starting my day with that combo, and I think that it's been pretty effective so far. But I'll keep you guys up to date on future webinars. Athena has a question. Would gut inflammation translate or create inflammation in the prostate or the brain? What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Tracy?
Well, I would say definitely yes. Well, yes and no. So it definitely could. There's the gut-brain axis picture that we deal with. And the gut can kind of create inflammation all over the body, I think. But then there are also some things that directly create inflammation in the brain or directly create inflammation in the prostate. So I think that starting with the gut is a really good starting place for just about anything. But also, this is where knowing the genetics. If you have a tendency toward inflammation in the vessels, that's going to affect your brain, and it can affect the prostate. So just it depends on what your genes are and what your life is like and what the result of testing would be. But I definitely see a correlation there, that it could affect it for sure.
Yeah, like it can be local or systemic. Like I think gut especially is so far reaching in the different things that it impacts that I wouldn't put it past, anything. Like the gut can absolutely cause inflammation manifesting anywhere in the body. So I think that you're right. It's yes and no. So Kevin has a question about molecular hydrogen. So he's currently breathing molecular hydrogen, which is great. Comments on the gut benefits of breathing hydrogen and oxygen at times. So my understanding of hydrogen and molecular hydrogen is that it's a little bit more tailored towards, I mean, it's got anti-inflammatory as well as antioxidant benefits, which are going to benefit pretty much every system in the body. My understanding is it's a little bit more towards the mitochondrial pathway. When you breathe it in, I would imagine it also helps detoxify the respiratory tract, but I've always used hydrogen in its tablet form to activate the NRF2 pathway for mitochondria to help kind of clear out free radicals quicker. But I don't know that it would have any additional benefits on the gut, except for the fact that this is all connected, right? And if we can deal with toxins and we can lower inflammation, then it's going to have some benefits everywhere. Do you have an opinion on that, Dr. Tracy?
I think you said it well.
Okay. But molecular hydrogen is great. I do use it daily. It's just I use it in a different format. So Sheila has a question about that dominance thing that we talked about earlier. So what does being co-dominant mean and what can I do? So this is interesting. So the pathway that I touched on earlier in the call with regard to CYP17A1 and that conversion of progesterone to testosterone, that's just the first step. So that creates what we call a dominance. From there, we look at what happens. How does that testosterone kind of steer on the path? Is it androgenizing, which means it's converting to DHT, dihydrotestosterone, which is basically testosterone on testosterone, right? And there's a gene called SRD5A2 that's in charge of that. Or is it aromatizing, right? So there's another gene called CYP19A1 that's really in charge of that. And if you're doing a little bit of both, then we call it co-dominance, right? So if the testosterone, more of it is androgenizing, you're androgen dominant. If it's aromatizing, you're estrogen dominant. If it's kind of splitting the pathway and you're getting a little bit of both, then you're what's called co-dominant. So you're dominant in the first place, but you're getting some conversion to both of those as far as your enzymes are concerned. To me, co-dominance actually can be a pretty beneficial profile if you mitigate the actual toxic elements of the DHT as well as the estrogens. So, I mean, lifestyle is going to matter a lot there, right? Like, for example, your body composition. Body fat has aromatase enzyme in it. So, if you're overweight, I'm not saying you are, but if you are, then you're going to get more steering towards estrogen. And based on what Dr. Tracy said earlier with the CYP1A1 and the CYP1B1 enzymes, we can see how much toxic metabolites are going to be created within that. So, you have to kind of know the entirety of the pathway to know if there's actually a risk factor there with like a lot of, for example, 4-hydroxyestrogen or 16-alpha hydroxyestrogen. Dr. Tracy, what do you think about that? Like if someone comes to you and they're co-dominant, like what's your main go-tos? Like do you utilize DIM and sulforaphane, I3C? Is it more lifestyle diet related? Like what do you go to?
It would depend on what was happening further down in their detoxification, and what's happening with their another gene that if you give them DIM or something like that, they could get stuck in a less in a more toxic in between state. So it really would depend on their genetics what I would do. So, but I do utilize DIM and I3C and sulforaphane. I like sulforaphane because it does a completely different thing. And so you don't have to worry about that one if you have a gene that DIM would rev up too much and end up in that state where you can't finish clearing it. DIM also has more of an estrogen lowering effect, so it would also depend on who the person was and where they were in their life, whether or not I would use that at all.
Yeah, I find DIM supplements over the counter are like really high dosed as well. And it's like it gets a little bit complicated, you know, especially if you're like, for example, a cycling female, because there's going to be those ebbs and flows in the estrogen. Like regardless of what the genes say, you're still on a cycle. It's just that the cycle is amplified if you're dominant there, right? So it's like some people will jump on a DIM supplement and it's like 100 milligrams and they take it 30 days out of 30 days and they end up with like it can cause a lot of GI upset in a lot of people and it's really over moderating the pathway and that can happen. So like a lot of these things I recommend having guidance from a practitioner because usually if I get someone on DIM, it'll be like way less. It'll be like 20 milligrams or something of DIM. And you may want to cycle it based on kind of where you're at. So it's not something I recommend just, well, I heard I'm estrogen dominant, so I'm going to jump on DIM. I think that it's a little bit too risky to do that because it's a really powerful extract and it's very concentrated, more than you would get from just eating broccoli, some of the, actual sources of it. So practitioner guidance when it comes to hormone issues definitely I think is valuable because there can be consequences to the wrong intervention. But yeah, that's codominance. I mean, there's other things you can do for the DHT or like green tea extract and different things can help kind of counteract that. But to Dr. Tracy's point, this is an added thing of like your total toxin load, right? And I would want to make sure that you're methylating properly. I would want to make sure you're on the right diet. I would want to make sure that the sleep is there, that we have detox strategies present, on and on. So it's the whole thing, like we talked about. We treat the whole person, not just an isolated gene and a symptom stemming from it. Okay, so Janice has a question. I've been told I'm glucose and dairy intolerant. I've been avoiding both. Do you recommend staying away from these entirely or cutting down? So that there's a lot of things going on with that question. Hey, Dr. Tracy, because
Yes.
it's like, even within dairy, right? It's like intolerance of dairy can be stemming from a few areas. Is it the casein in the dairy that's causing that? Is it the lactose in the dairy that's causing that? Is that going to be more of a problem with A1 versus A2 dairy? Can you take a lactase enzyme and mitigate some of those issues? Is it fermented dairy versus just, grocery store dairy? There's raw dairy. There's colostrum. There's a lot of going on within the dairy kind of aspects here. So I would recommend finding that part out as well. Like you can test if you've done our gene test. MCM6 is the gene that we look at, and that's actually for the lactose itself, right? So if you're intolerant to lactose, that's a genetic thing, and some people just can't have anything with lactose, but that doesn't mean dairy. That means lactose, right? Kind of the sugar and the protein found in dairy. And it's easy to mitigate because you can just take a lactase enzyme, and it goes in and it eats the lactose, so you don't have a reaction. With regard to glucose, though, I'm not certain that I understand there's so many different ways, like the body manufactures glucose. If you eat too much protein, it'll convert to glucose. So a glucose intolerance, I'm wondering what that means, like a fructose intolerance. Do you have an opinion on that, Dr. Tracy?
Well, and I guess I'm wondering if they did a glucose tolerance test as part of a bigger workup around their metabolic health, or if they meant to type gluten. Those are the two questions that I have about this question.
Okay.
In terms of if you took a glucose tolerance test and that didn't go well, then working with your physician on your metabolic health and seeing what the cause of that is important. I would not just try and figure that out yourself for sure. And I'm curious, like how, like the question reads, I've been told these things. And so what kind of testing was done to establish that? And what was the criteria used? Because that changes my answer. If you have some sort of picture where you have poor gut health and you can build back your gut to a place where it can digest dairy again, that's one thing. Whereas if you have a genetic thing where you can't digest lactose, that's a different thing. And it really matters how you feel. So it's a more complicated situation, like Justin said.
Yeah, and if you did mean gluten, then that simplifies it a little bit because it's like we look at a family of genes called HLA, and that can really be great indicators as to how sensitive you are. And we look at it as kind of a spectrum from like not sensitive at all to like full on celiac sensitivity, and then the in between being non celiac gluten sensitivity. So it kind of exists on a range. There's an enzyme called dipeptidyl peptidase, and that's basically an enzyme that goes in and eats gluten. So that's in the category of like supplements you can have on hand if you have just a normal sensitivity to gluten, to where you don't have to restrict yourself forever and ever. You can just use the enzyme to counteract the downsides of that. But if it's like celiac level gluten sensitivity, yeah, my advice is absolutely stay away from it. Try not to be in the same province with it if you can, because it's definitely going to have a reaction in your body. Um, so the last question is from Lisa. How do you know whether any given gene is optimal or suboptimal? I love it. So what I would recommend is doing our DNA 360 test. Honestly, it is meant to be a pretty self-navigable template that it gives you. And it says this is the gene, it gives a brief description, and then it gives your genotype and whether or not that is the optimal or suboptimal or kind of a moderate genotype there. If you are new to it and you've not done the DNA 360, I do recommend doing some sort of discovery call as well. Just because even a half hour with a practitioner to kind of go over it with a fine tooth comb and really get the most out of it, understanding the red flags, etc. It can go a long way, right? Because the report is well made, but it's made on an algorithm, right? And like I said, we don't treat the DNA test, we treat the person, but we know how to correlate and use the genes to actually see like what's gone on in your body. But that's how you do it. You get your genes tested. Doing it through us is a great option because we don't sell your data. I mean, there's cybersecurity issues within this particular industry, and we're top of the line, of course. So I recommend the DNA 360. And it looks like
And
that.
now,
Go ahead.
we have something exciting for you, which is you have early access using the code GUT130 to unlock $130 off, bringing it down to just $5.99 for our recently upgraded due to new technology Gut 360 test.
There it is, folks. You are in an elite group of people who get this discount. It is not available to everybody, so make sure to take advantage, and the links and everything are in the chat. Dr. Tracy, this was a lot of fun. I can't believe that we haven't done one together yet. So this was our first time, but I really appreciate it. And it's crazy that like every one of us has just a little something different in our background. Like, can you name another acupuncturist / functional genomics practitioner? Like, I feel like it's an interesting combo that you've kind of arrived at.
I don't know any yet, but hopefully there will be more.
Yeah, well, that's what's good. I mean, I love that you're on the team. We've all got our own little expertise areas, and that's why we get so many different perspectives and things coming into these webinars. So thank you very much for being here. And thanks to everybody for showing up. You know, we roll up on a weekly basis because of you guys. And if you keep showing up, we'll keep rolling up as well and trying to give you the best advice possible. So thank you. And this was a lot of fun tonight. I hope to see everybody for the rest of the week. We got a couple more this week.